Hello and welcome to the dark side. Okay, I might love my intro music just a little bit too much. I'm quite impressed with it. So I'm sorry about my video quality this evening. I'm having a lighting issue, otherwise known as the light bulbs have blown in my office. So never mind. We'll work that out for next time. But today, welcome to the dark side. We are at season 4. We're delighted that you are joining us this evening for an action-packed show. TC Storm, how did you enjoy your time off the dark side?
Yeah, great.
Did you get anything joyous and light coming in during the off season?
Yeah, my life is joyous and light, isn't it?
A plethora of joy and light and bubbliness. Well, unfortunately, the world doesn't stop turning when we are off. In fact, the news can often seem like it gets worse and worse. So we are going to speed through some highlights to get to this evening's discussion topic, which is profit before people, the end of capitalism. So this is going to be interesting. So let's do some news stories today. I've picked a selection of my favorite ones. Although when I say favorite, I think that seems wrong. I've picked a selection that seems suitable to be discussed on the dark side. I think that's more appropriate. So point number 1 was big news story is that the Prince, formerly known as Andrew, or the Andrew, formerly known as Prince, I don't know which way around you want to do it. Prince Andrew has been stripped finally of all of his titles. This ongoing saga, for those of you that don't live in the UK and are not privy to kind of the ins and outs of the royal family, or just do not keep up with the royal family, has been going now for what seems like decades, I think. There has always been a rumor mill around Andrew and his behavior, and that heightened with the arrest of Epstein and subsequent arrest and conviction of Ghislaine. And Prince Andrew has been wanted in connection to crimes against young women. One in particular is pursuing this now through the civil courts in the States, and her case, the judge said he has a case to answer. So it's going to go ahead. And the Queen has finally stripped Andrew of all of his military honors, titles, etc. After, it must be added, she did not do this by herself, but it is after 147 retired military service people wrote to her and said that he is bringing dishonor to the entire British military by retaining any of his honors. The reason I find this story quite necessary on the dark side is because we have talked about last year how Harry was stripped of his titles, ones that he'd actually earned and worked hard for. It has to be said that he actually served with the soldiers side by side in combat, no matter how difficult it was to keep him there. And he was stripped simply for wanting to have some privacy with his wife, and not wanting to be at the forefront of royal duties. He didn't even quit royal duties. He just said he didn't want to be a lead senior royal anymore, and they stripped him of everything. But this man, who is accused of molestation, rape with underage girls, etc., the girls are girls with children, has managed to retain his titles. So I find that quite interesting. And horrifying and frightening all at the same time. I don't know why TC Storm has suddenly left me. Feels like he's left me while I've gone on a rant. But I'm coming towards the end of my rant. Are you coming back in? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
You were just playing around.
No, you were talking, so
You disappeared.
I left you to talk, innit?
Well, I know that you have something to say on this, so now I'm done. That was why I thought we should talk about it.
Oh, what you want me to say about the dirty bungle?
For those of you not from a Caribbean, the dirty bungle is not a particularly nice term for somebody. Anyway, yes. So
What you I don't understand. What is there to say? I mean, look, here's the thing. There's a adage: those birds of a feather flock together.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah,
There's numerous pictures of Andrew with Epstein, Maxwell. You know, what
and
you may say?
underage girls.
There's there's no smoke without fire. You know, this is another thing that's also said, and it's interesting. You know that I hear these sentiments expressed quite often regarding certain groups of people
Which sentiments are
and
those?
crime. There's no smoke without fire, birds of a feather, etc.,
Okay,
etc.,
those
etc.
sentiments. Yes.
It's funny that the people that usually express those sentiments don't wish to apply it here.
Yes, I find it really interesting that that is true, and also to add to that, that this week we've seen another breaking news story about Harry, um, and I think to myself, it's quite convenient that every time Andrew does something, Harry's on the firing line. It's really convenient that every single time mountain pressure comes to deal with Andrew and whatever cases he has to answer across the globe, that suddenly you can find more news stories and stuff to say about Harry. And it's as if Harry has been the go-to scapegoat if you look at the media coverage of Andrew for quite some
Yeah,
time.
yeah. Look, here's my feeling on the situation, and that is that the royal family would rather have the bungle in the family than a black person or a ginger.
Well, this really does seem
You
to be the
know,
case.
that's just the reality of it.
It really does. It very sadly does seem to be that way. Well, moving on to other parties who believe themselves to be royal, I think at this point, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, is yet again in hot water because he has had not just numerous allegations now that there were parties allegedly had. It now transpires that every Friday night, while everyone else was locked up, Number 10 was hosting a drink up in the garden. And everybody was out there having a good old time because they were so stressed from dealing with the pandemic. He still has his job, mind you.
Look, look. Yeah. How do I put this? Boris has always lived by the idea that he was exempt from the rules. The rules were for everybody else besides him. Um, he's displayed this when he was mayor of London. He displays this as prime minister. But even when you look at his old school reports that were released, he
Oh,
displayed it as a child. One of his teachers remarked that he felt as though Boris felt as though the rules didn't apply to him. And so this is who he is. This is who he will always be. And as long as he panders to a certain group of people, he will continue to get away with it.
mhm. Yeah, I think that Boris Johnson tells a lot about British racism, if I'm honest. I feel like if you want to do a study in British class race and politics, Boris Johnson seems to be the epitome of how that all collides in a human being. He is he is on record as racist, he's on record as sexist, he's on record as homophobic, he's on record as being anti different religious groups, and yet still he's also on record as not upholding any kind of normal kind of standard of of duty in political senses, and his personal life's a bit of a train wreck as well. And he's able to get away with all of that because he utters the correct phrases for white, classist, racist, elitists, and white poor people will support him because they believe that white is right and he's going to get that Brexit done and he's going to get those people out and he's going to do the thing. And so I think it's for me, it's always when we talk about Boris Johnson in the UK and they talk about the fact that, oh, racism in the UK is not so bad. Boris Johnson is the epitome of why racism in the UK is that bad. Like, he really is kind of the poster child of why is Britain still a racist, classist, sexist society? Boris Johnson. He's just the example.
Boris is getting Brexit done, but the only people getting roasted are poor people. And it doesn't really matter what color you are. But
Poor is poor, right?
they haven't stopped to notice that. I think for me, though, the biggest aspect to this story is that it shows the erosion between the barriers of the different institutions in Britain. You no longer have a political system that is semi-detached from a judicial system. Because the reality is the police should be investigating the events that took place, and they are not. And so for me, that is the biggest danger and the biggest sign to come out of what has occurred. And here's the thing, whether you agree with lockdowns or not is irrelevant in this. The law existed, the law was broken, and the police are refusing to investigate. And that is a problem, because once you no longer have the separation of those institutions, you're essentially declaring that corruption is good to go.
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk about corruption, nice little link there. Thank you very much. We're going to move to the United States of America for two news stories that I feel really we had to cover out of, I think, respect for the victims of these news stories. I think that it's not just the victims, their families and their local communities, but I think both stories show the level to which the justice system in the United States is not just. It's not a justice system. It's a legal framework, but it's not a justice system. And I listened to an interview with one of the justices, Justice Sotomayor. I hope I've said that correctly, where she says that people look to the law for justice and they're looking in the wrong place, because when they look at the law for justice, that's not necessarily what they're going to get. What they're going to get is a legal framework, and the justice that's found within that legal framework is often why they are left frustrated. And I think to myself, that was such a powerful interview. It was on Red Table Talks, the Estefans edition. And it was such a powerful interview because it really drove home the point as to why people are saying abolition is the way in the United States, because justice isn't really what it is. So let's talk about the two cases. Two very different cases, I will say. One is that of Bobby Sneed, who is 75 years old. He was in prison for 47 years, and he was in prison under the felony murder charge, which is that although he didn't commit the crime, he was associated with the crime. He was actually a lookout at a crime, and therefore he still got the mandatory sentence of the highest criminal in, which happened to be murder, of course, felony murder. However, 75 years old, he is finally voted on the 18th of March 2021 to be released. Good news, you might think. However, 2 days before his release, he has a heart attack due to COVID-related illnesses, and he has a heart attack. He's rushed into hospital. They give him medical treatment, but that medical treatment lasts longer than the 2 days of which he's supposed to obviously be released. So he's supposed to be released 2 days, but he stays in hospital for, I believe it's something like 14 days. And on release of those 14 days, you and I, living in Europe, might think, where is he going to go? He's obviously going home. But no, Bobby Sneed ends up going back to jail because they arrest him on his release for parole violation. And they say that the parole violation that he's guilty of is a drug offense. So now I know that for those of you that are watching this, your blood might actually boil, because you'll think, well, how, while you're in medical care, would you possibly get drugs? Well, those drugs, of course, are being given to you medically by medical professionals, and that's the drug offense. Further to that, the evidence that was presented wasn't even evidence related to Bobby. It was related to who knows who. They can't even prove where this evidence comes from. So, of course, it's immediately vacated and he should be released. But as of the 11th of January, Bobby Sneed is still sitting in prison. You heard that right. That's almost 9 months later than March. And the reason he's still sitting in prison, because during the time of the vacation where it was vacated, so this false arrest that they did for him was vacated. They said, oh, sorry, our bad, our mistake. They managed to re-arrest him in jail for parole violation again. So he's in jail and he's being rearrested again for parole violation. And you can only be on parole when you're outside of the prison walls. And he hasn't managed to get outside of the prison walls because they've kept him locked up. And the parole violation, they can't even find the documentation for it. It doesn't even seem very clear what the parole violation is for. His lawyers are literally trying everything to get him out now. They're appealing to every government, but the the state in which he is incarcerated is Louisiana, and Louisiana incarcerates more people per capita than any other state in the USA. And they are having to go to federal court in order to try and get this man out of prison. He is 75 years old. He has served 47 years for being a lookout, not for actually doing any of the heinous crime, but for being a lookout. So that's in and of itself really bad. But on top of that, when he's supposed to be released, they are arresting him for fake crimes. Then, while in prison, they're arresting him for parole violation, but you can't be on parole unless you're outside of the prison. And the governor is not listening to anybody, and the police and the the system that does that is not listening to anybody and is refusing to release this man from prison. Point blank, just refusing.
Yeah, well, I think the story is actually a bit worse than what you described, because he has the heart attack in prison. They administered the narcotics to him in the prison.
That's what I said.
No, you didn't explain that the narcotics were administered in the prison. You said in the hospital. And I think we need to be clear on this. The narcotics were administered to him in the prison. So the prison gave him the narcotics, administered the narcotics, and then accused him of being on drugs.
And let's just point out that narcotics this is just the regular medicine in order to...
Yes, this is painkillers. We're talking about morphine, things like that. Yeah.
They're trying to save his life and keep him alive. We're not talking about just like injecting heroin in his system to try and, I don't know, do what, kill him quicker. But they were doing their medical job. And that's the point. They're doing their medical job. And you're accusing him of taking a narcotic, which is the narcotic you gave him to save his life.
Yeah. So I think that is one of the points that needed to be brought out of the story. Yeah, look, the reality is you're not gonna see justice. This guy will probably die on the inside.
I really hope
not. Of the prison.
The worst thing is, I mean, I say I really hope not, and I really hope for his family, for all of those working on the case, that he is released, that he gets to breathe fresh air outside of a prison, he gets to sleep in a bed, He gets to breathe his last breath with his family and be at peace. Having said that, I know that he will be suffering from being incarcerated in the American justice system, which is, of course, in the American legal system, which is just a machine and a beast. Louisiana, as I said, is one of the highest culprits for incarcerating people in the USA. But on top of that, they have arrested him while he's in prison for parole violation.
Yeah.
I would be afraid for this man that if he left prison, they would just rearrest him on the exit door and be like, well,
But that's actually what happened.
they
So
didn't let
he
him
was
get to the exit door.
no, because what actually happened was he was leaving the prison, right? They said that he had to be released. So when it was vacated, the judge ordered him to be released. So he was actually leaving the prison,
And
and
they
on his
arrested him the
way
second
out
time.
of the prison, he's literally at the prison exit door. They went and arrested him.
Again,
Yeah,
for the second time. Yeah.
right.
No,
Accusing
but
him
my
of
point is he would be in his home and he would end up dying because bear in mind, this man's had a heart attack. His health
Mhm.
is fragile. He's not, the American health system's not great. So he's in fragile condition. So he's going to be released and you're going to go and bust down I think that they would go and bust down his door, give the man a second heart attack and kill him. Like that's literally what they would do. And I would feel afraid for his safety and his life. I mean, what's he going to do? He's 75 years old. What is he going to do? Like,
You think his death would be that ambiguous? It'll be. I thought he had a gun.
anyway,
Look,
to me, it just shows, I think, the level of the number of things wrong with the so-called USA justice system. If this was about justice, he's serving 47 years for being a lookout for his friends. That in itself is a whole conversation. But even if you want to go, well, the person on the other end, they got murdered, so it's important that everyone suffers. Even if that's your position, after serving 47 years and your legal system declares that you should be free to go, being arrested for the drugs you administered to me to save my life, that's not justice. Being arrested, leaving a jail for parole violation is not justice. Being in jail with the parole board now refusing to release you because they can is not justice. Where is the justice? There isn't justice. This 75-year-old man is just suffering on suffering on suffering. And why? For what reason? At what point is enough enough? This isn't about justice, and it's definitely not about rehabilitation. So let's not lie to ourselves.
It's never about justice, and I think the other thing that this case shows is the disparity in which the law is applied. So, why is it that in this case he gets charged with the highest charge for being a participant? But when police officers are there during assaults on civilians or when they kill civilians, the officers that are there and that don't do anything to stop it are not also charged.
With felony murder. Why was I can think of the George Floyd killing. Why were all those officers surrounding?
Well, they are being charged.
But with
But
felony murder?
manslaughter, I think one of them might. No, I think they're all up on manslaughter, various charges. But the point is, it's very rare. I mean,
It's rare.
the George Floyd case is an anomaly, right? It's a
No,
complete
because you
anomaly
could
for
name
that,
100 other cases. Breonna Taylor, you could name 100 other
right?
cases.
So, but the point is, I'm just saying that it shows the disparity in the
Yeah.
application of law. So don't look to the system for justice. So, yeah, the next case.
The next case is quite a different case. It's the one of Judge Robert Adrian. It is a rape case. A 16-year-old girl is raped. She attends a party. At that party, she turns down the advances of a young man who is 18 years old She tells him no, and she goes on to have a lovely time at the party up until she finds herself with a pillow on her face being raped by said young man. The perpetrator is arrested. He is found guilty. It's very clear cut. She manages to struggle to get off him when she realizes what's happening to her. And it's all very clear cut until Judge Robert Adrian decides otherwise. Now, Judge Robert Adrian has decided that this 18-year-old man who served 148 days in prison and is up for now sentencing before the judge, the mandatory minimum sentence is 4 years. And he decides that 148 days is more than enough for the crime that this young man has committed. The mandatory 4 years is no, it's not appropriate for this judge. So he chooses to he realizes that he cannot just ignore the mandatory minimum. So he has decided to come up with a different system, because if he ignores the mandatory minimum, then that would obviously conflict with his job. He has an obligation to do that. So instead, he declares and vacates the judgment based on the fact that the prosecutor haven't proven their case, even though the case has been proven, tried, proven, convicted in his own court. And then goes on to blame the girl's parents, victimize them for allowing their 16-year-old to go to a party and be in the position where she should be raped, because goodness forbid that, you know, young people just have fun and don't expect to get raped. Young girls just go out and have fun with their friends and not expect that the boy they turn down is going to turn into a rapist. Have I given a clear enough picture of the judge's wickedness?
Yeah, maybe. Sorry, what was the judge's name again?
Judge Robert Adrian.
See, because every time you say Robert, I just hear R. Kelly. I mean, you know, I mean, they're not too far off. I mean,
Robert,
he might not be R. Kelly, but he's Robert-ish.
He's Robert-ish, yes. He definitely, yes. No, it's...
Look, here's the thing.
Illinois. This one was in Illinois, of course.
It shows, once again, the fact that this is not a system designed for justice.
No.
Because, listen, I haven't, just for, transparency's sake, I haven't gone trawling through this judge's judgments. But I can guarantee you he's handed out some mandatory minimum sentences before. Probably, for somebody having a joint or something like that. And, I'm sure he had no problems handing out that mandatory minimum. So why does he have a problem with this mandatory minimum? And since when was 150 days
48.
enough? Okay. For rape. Since when was that a punishment that suited the crime of rape? When you probably gave longer to someone having a joint.
Wow.
So I think it throws that up. I think it throws up the fact that how much leeway this judge has to declare. So remember, they've gone through the trial. The jury has found him guilty. The judge accepted that. So you're now at a sentencing hearing. This hearing happens a little bit after the verdict is pronounced.
Yep.
So you've accepted the verdict.
Yep.
But what you've now done is said, I'm going to ignore the jury verdict.
Mm-hmm.
And because I don't have any other recourse to avoid giving this person a 4-year mandatory minimum, I'm going to declare
Mhm.
that the prosecution did not prove their case. Now, you accepted the prosecution's case.
Yep.
You accepted the verdict.
Yep.
And
Yep.
now it's a problem. So
Yep.
I want to know, how many brown envelopes exchanged hands?
I hope that does that translate to everybody's culture and context if you say a brown envelope? Money, bribery, does that so just to be clear that it translates to everyone's context. If you say that a brown envelope changed hands, it is normally a bribery that is given.
Don't put words in my mouth now. I'm simply saying I want to know how many brown envelopes change hands between those two dates. Yeah.
Yeah, well.
I mean, I will note that he has now been removed from criminal cases. So he's no longer responsible for criminal cases. He sits over civil cases. But I think that's just as bad. He needs to be
Well,
disbarred.
he needs to be disbarred because
Right?
in the US legal system, a lot of times the only place that a person can get justice is in the civil courts, because the criminal courts, as we have just established, does not give justice. And if this young lady then had to take this young man to civil court to see some sort of penalization for his crime, she'd get the same judge. No, brethren, that man needs to go.
Right. So as I said, he needs to be taken off. But I think his behavior needs to be looked at for possibly being criminal.
Woo! Just
Right?
really.
Because I'm pretty sure he's broken a law or something along the way there in the way that he set aside the verdict.
Yeah.
And how he said, look, he accepted it and then says, well, the only way I can circumvent the system is to declare that you didn't prove your case, despite the fact that you did.
Right.
Because I think what it does is it sets a dangerous precedent now, if they don't do something about this, in which any judge who says, I don't think that the mandatory minimum, the law, should apply to this person for whatever reason, i.e. they're rich, then the judge just simply has to declare that the prosecution hasn't proven their case.
Yep, that pretty much is what needs to happen. And the fact that you're giving local judges such power in a corrupt system. I mean, you're talking about arrest and lock up rapists, but we already have discussed on this show how low the rate of firstly arrest, then even go into trial and then even getting a conviction. It's like the lowest of the criminal cases that you can get. Rape is right down there as, can you get a conviction? No. For men and women who are subject to what is arguably a life-shattering criminal act against them, they aren't getting the justice. And this human decided that it is within his power to make that even worse. So if you live in Illinois, our hearts go out to you, because we hope that nothing bad ever happens to you, because if you end up in one of these courts, you're never going to get justice. That's not what you're going to get.
Yeah, and listen, here's the thing. I'm like, listen, the girl woke up to a pillow over her face. I'm like, this guy put some thought into it. I'd even say he's been perfecting his MO, he's been perfecting the practice. I'm pretty sure from the description of things, this is highly unlikely to be his first time.
No, this was not a fumbled attempt. This was the fact that, and I deliberately said, because I think when I originally heard the case, they told you all the details, and then at the end they said, oh, by the way, she had earlier in the evening turned him down. And I was like, hold on, that's actually critical to the whole story.
Yeah, absolutely.
The fact that this young girl, this man approached her, and this young girl turned around and was like, no, not today, not ever. And then she wakes up to a pillow over her face, being raped. And when she manages to get free, it's the same said, adult male who was perpetrating that crime against her that she had turned down. I'm like, that goes to his motivation, his intent, his actual the level of wickedness to which he actually thought that through. Because, you know, how many times has he done that before? How many times will he go on to do that since you vacated the judgment? And now he will not be on the sex offenders list, and now he will not be registered there, and he will not have, you know,
He will not have the opportunity to experience the pleasure of his own actions.
Just saying. Just saying. So that was our news stories for today. You know, it really is quite difficult. I will be honest with you. The world is a very sad place. And it's very difficult to bring you news each week and to narrow down which stories we're going to cover, especially when we're off. We've had a season break, which we had at the end of season 3, beginning first season 4. It's very difficult to figure out which stories we're going to bring to you. But I hope that you realize that what we're trying to do is educate you to the fact that, you know, sometimes people are looking for the boogeyman in one place, but quite often those places, neither here nor there, the most obvious criminal bad activities are happening right in front of you. They're happening in governments, Boris Johnson. They're happening in royalty, Prince Andrew. They're happening in everyday judge cases in Illinois, in penitentiary systems in, where was that one? Louisiana. They happen in broad daylight right in front of us. And if we continue to look for mysterious organizations who are architecting really bad things, it means that we're not campaigning and we're not helping people who need it right in front of us. We're not helping our neighbors and our friends and those people who are suffering right in front of us. So that's why we bring the stories that we do, just to educate you a little bit about the world and how dark it is. And on that note, I think
the world's a great place.
Well, our prayers are going out to the people of Tonga. Is that correct? Have I said that right?
Yeah.
In the South Pacific, who have just experienced a volcano, an underwater volcano, which has spread ash and left quite a lot of damage in its wake on the islands. And there is very little communication coming off because, of course, it destroyed communication. And so at the moment, our hearts and prayers go out to people there who are trying to get in touch with loved ones, who are trying to see how their family and their homes and how people are doing. So far, there have not been any reported deaths. But that being said, there's very little communication, so we won't know until communication has been raised up. So it's a wonderful, beautiful place, but it's also a very dangerous place. On that note, we're going to go to our topic of the evening, which is profit before people, the end of capitalism. Or not, as the case may be. The wishful end of capitalism. What should be the end of capitalism, but we keep reviving it. So there was a discussion out of New Zealand, I believe you're going to bring us, about the Reserve Bank and them talking about the maximum efficient employment rate. Woo! Say
maximum sustainable employment rate.
Oh, okay. I have efficient, but all right, cool.
Okay. So basically, there is something called the maximum sustainable employment rate. And what it does is it sets out minimum and maximum levels for employment or unemployment. And this rate can change, it varies. And it's not just New Zealand that has this practice, Canada, the US. In fact, I would say pretty much every country in the world, especially those with a capitalist leaning, employ some form of this.
Okay, so this is where my little business brain's going to have to be like, listen, brother, I don't agree with this. I don't agree with you. I find that you're overstating your case to make your case. This is not how unemployment figures are talked about in other parts of the world. And in fact, I think the story and the articles that we've read have demonstrated why people don't talk about employment and don't use this metric, because it is not healthy. Shall we put it like that?
Right.
Anyway, bring your evidence.
So, okay, so as a business major that you are, is full employment desirable? Is 100% employment desirable?
Is it desirable? Is it desirable that everyone is employed? That can be employed.
Yes.
That can be employed, because
Yes.
that's a critical part of the question.
Yes.
Yes, it is desirable that there is 100%.
Desirable to whom?
Well, in some countries, arguably desirable to the economy that you have 100% employment. If they could have people work in 2 or 3 jobs, they would enjoy that quite a lot, quite frankly. Work the population into the ground.
Right. Except that that's not actually the case.
Okay, listen, just bring your evidence. Stop trying to be all smart about it.
Right. So basically, the maximum sustainable employment, what that says is that there's a minimum level of unemployment that you need in order to control inflation. Right. So what it says is that stretched workforce increases wages, which then leads to an inflationary increases.
Mm-hmm.
And so traditionally, it's been an inverse correlation between, or inverse link between, employment and inflation. That's how it's typically been seen, except that that's not always played out over the past 50 years. And you can even, the IMF even points this out in an article they did in 2020 called Unemployment, the Curse of Joblessness. Right? So you have then also business major, the Phillips curve.
Okay.
Right. So this tracks the inverse relationship between unemployment and wage inflation. Okay.
Right.
And it's a model that is often used by people that are creating fiscal plans and policies, governments that are creating fiscal plan and policies, bodies all that are doing likewise. And what it observes is, as I said, the inverse relationship between unemployment and wage inflation. And what A.W. Phillips is the guy that came up with this model. What he also says is that if there's too great a change, or if the rate of unemployment or shifts too quickly, it also triggers inflationary increases.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you have is governments and fiscal bodies employing these models when they're creating their policies. And what this model actually says is we need a certain level of unemployment to avoid inflation.
To avoid high inflation.
Right? Yes. And why do you want to avoid the inflation?
Well, I think if you ask that to, let me move forward again as I'm in my listening position. If you ask that to European countries who are suffering under the high inflation rates, otherwise known as food, fuel, and housing prices going through the roof in this last years, they would like to avoid it. So called for the people who are suffering under the burden of high inflation.
Okay, except that the actual reason you want to avoid high inflation is because in order to deal with high inflation, you have to increase workers' wages.
Yeah, well, there's an argument
And
about
so,
interest rates, wages. Yeah.
right? So the reality is that this policy exists, right? Not to control high inflation, but actually to control workers' wages.
Okay.
Right? But
Okay.
this policy, but so this concept of maximum sustainable employment, though,
Mm-hmm.
I think before we even deal with that, I think I want to deal with the two assumptions that it makes. First, I said that there must always be a certain number of unemployed people, because I think, especially within a capitalist society and especially within the States, you
Mm-hmm.
hear so many people say, just pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You can do it. You can change your life around. But actually, when you understand, actually, the policies are designed so that there will be a certain amount of people that can never do that.
Mm.
Right. And the second is that it's more desirable, or profit is more desirable than paying a fair or living wage. Because the reality is, yes, we're talking about inflationary costs in Europe, fuel, food, etc. But these companies are still raking in millions and billions in profits.
Mm.
So the question isn't, can these companies afford it? They can afford it. They just don't want to increase wages so that the workers aren't suffering. So you have this concept of maximum sustainable employment to keep inflation low, but that's not actually for the worker.
No.
That's so that companies don't have to increase wages.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, what I see this is, or what I see this being played out, because this is a policy New Zealand has implemented recently or stated publicly that they're doing, is that it's a recognition that your system, or the capitalistic system that you're talking about, is not working.
Mm.
It has to be finely managed. And as I said, I don't believe that capitalism actually exists anywhere in the world. You have socialism of some sort in pretty much every Western country.
Mm.
You have in the US, let's take the US for example, because it's held up as this great shining light of capitalist country. Why is it that the airlines are subsidized? Why is it that farmers are subsidized?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that the motor industry is subsidized? Why is it that businesses can get all these subsidies
And tax breaks,
and tax breaks,
tax evasions, just
but the
tax
average
avoid.
person can't?
Right.
Because for me, if it was truly a capitalist society,
Right.
hey, you sink or swim.
Right.
You find a way, but you cope with it. And the market will determine whether you stay in business or whether you go out of business.
Right. Right. So we've had this discussion backwards and forwards about the maximum sustainable employment, and we have our differences as to whether I think that that's what's employed as a tactic in countries or not. But I think the point that you're making over wages, over capitalism, is a point that I can agree with. Like, at the end of the day, when we talk about capitalism and we talk about this great shining thing that we've made in the 20th, 19th, 20th century of capitalism, and how amazing is capitalism, and we hold this up as an economic system. If you've ever studied economics, if you've ever studied politics, if you study tax, you realize very quickly that the story that you're told about capitalism and the actual practice of what you're seeing are two different things. And the point that you're making about the amount of actual subsidies and actual tax breaks that companies are given and support that companies are given versus the actual people is actually quite shocking. And so if we wanted to put it in terms of welfare, the people on welfare are going to be the companies. That's what's on a welfare, because they're getting the level of tax breaks that they're getting, the level of subsidy that they're enjoying is so high that the average person would never benefit from anywhere near that level of support from their government. Never, ever you're going to get that level of support. So I think it's quite shocking to think of the amount of times that capitalism has been bailed out. So capitalism's been going and we've bailed it, the last bailout before what we're talking about now in terms of looking at the unemployment rate, the one before was the banking crisis. And most Western countries, except for Iceland, of course, which bucked the trend and their country is doing beautifully now without the aid of these lovely banks, bailed their banking systems out to the tune of billions, and in some cases trillions of pounds, dollars, euros, depending on your country. If it was genuinely a capitalist economy, those banks would have died and you could have just given the money to the people to save their savings. They could have just given you their evidence. You could have handed over some cash to them. You would have been better off than saving institutions that are repeating the same behaviors of risk that they were doing before. Profit before people. The lack of interest in the everyday lives of actual human beings from so-called capitalist systems is quite shocking.
Right. So my point in this is that having a maximum sustainable employment rate built into your fiscal policies means that you are actually managing the system for capitalism. In fact, you're not even managing it for capitalism. It essentially undermines capitalism.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is my argument that actually the whole point of this is to support a capitalistic mindset that is essentially dying. It's essentially on life support and unsustainable. And it's the inflationary aspect is part of the reason why cryptocurrencies are growing so much.
Yeah.
Because a lot of them have built within the system methods to help deal with inflation, which the current fiscal monetary system does not have.
Right.
The problem is if you upend the system and pull the rug out immediately, and you upend the board, those that are wealthy now will not necessarily be wealthy in a crypto state. And of course, that's why you have a lot of policies and a lot of crackdowns from a lot of countries to deal with these things. But as I said, once again, you look at the policies that are being implemented, and I'm like, you don't have capitalism. You don't have real, true capitalism being practiced. And if you did, I would probably be more in favor of a true capitalistic society than I am of the current one.
Yeah, because, so let's take something as simple as supply and demand. In a capitalistic society, they talk about the fact that supply and demand are your big pressures. So if your demand exceeds your supply, then prices will change accordingly. If supply exceeds demand, then prices will change accordingly. Okay, great. So tell me why my diesel and petrol costs the price that it does. Because currently we're living in a system in which most people have to stay at home. They're not driving, they're not traveling, they're not using the pumps in the ways that they did. You're not selling the volumes. Okay, your supply, you've got some supply issues, which are now actually resolved. You've got demand issues. The demand is lower than it has ever been. So exactly why is the price increasing the way it does? It's increasing because you're trying to make profit. It's never been about supply and demand. It's never been about the people. I can teach you that. I can teach you all the theory I want about supply and demand. I can teach you it and you can apply it to anything you want. And then there will come a point when supply and demand, you realize, something's wrong with this theory, because at a certain point, it doesn't apply to products and services and people anymore. Why is that? And that is simply because if you're always constantly putting profits, the profitability of something before the people, before the economy, before the environment, before all of those other practices, you're always going to end up with price hikes, because profit comes first. It doesn't care about the people. Profit will always come first. So, and that is something that doesn't matter. So if I have the supply and you're not buying it, then I'm just going to keep hiking up the profits until the people who actually have to buy it, I can make as much money out of them as possible. Whereas that shouldn't be the case, should it? No.
Yeah. So, I'd like to hear your view on the maximum sustainable employment as a idea, as a policy.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I have to be honest, a business major, so that's my former life, of course. I've never heard of the policies talked about in this way before. Mind you, that was studying a little while ago, so I can admit that I could be out of date. But when I remember talking about maximum efficient, maximum sustainable employment, within that there are a number of categories that have to be named, namely that there will always be people within your economy that are not working. You will always have retired, elderly, children, disabled, and others that are in what's the word I'm looking for, are not able to work for one reason or another, or not able to contribute to the fiscal capital of a country, but they may contribute in different ways. And so when I've heard those conversations on a national level, when you're looking at the economics behind employment and unemployment, you then have this secondary group of people who are then termed the unemployed. And those are people who are capable of working, who are not working. And can we get the figure for the people who are capable of working but not working as low as possible? And most people will, over the last 20, 30 years, remember, if you're listening to this, you're not even old enough, you will remember over the last 5 years hearing conversations, particularly in Trump era, about whether, under Obama it was low unemployment, high unemployment, whether it was lowest under Trump, whether, so when we talk about the kind of policies trying to achieve the lowest unemployment levels has always been, as I understood it, the goal. When you've been talking to me and I've been reading, and I have been reading about this kind of policy of maximum sustainable employment, one of the things that every economist says is that this is not good. This is not a good way to measure inflation, or to even have a policy around, because it sets up the idea, or this false idea, that there should be a number of people out of work. And economists seem to universally suggest that that is not a healthy system to set up a system with the intention of constantly having an unemployed population. That would create unrest, and it would create different problems, etc., etc. However, the link between the unemployment rate and wages is a different link altogether. And that link is quite interesting because, for example, in the Netherlands, we over the summer got to the point where there were more jobs than there were people able to take. And that created a challenge for the market, because on the one hand, the media is whipping up the people into a frenzy about foreigners coming here and taking their jobs. And you have extreme right parties made up of very horrible people talking about those immigrants coming here and stealing our jobs. And on the other hand, you have more jobs than people. So you have literally the unemployment number versus the number of jobs on the market. There were more jobs than people. You needed people to come and take the jobs. Germany also a few years ago, when they took a number of refugees in, had the same problem. They were experiencing the same problem. And actually, that's one of the reasons they took in a large number of people, was to help with this crisis where they had more jobs than they had people to fill the jobs. So the idea that a country would behind the scenes go, but we need a level of unemployment, in some ways is understandable in that discussion, because new jobs are being created. If you've got everyone working, we have a problem where you're getting new people from, and those job price, the wages should go up, except that we know in the Netherlands that's not happening. So the practice of what you're talking about doesn't actually happen. The fact that you have more jobs than people should mean that the wages go up in order to attract better people, because you're trying now to steal them from your competition, etc., etc. And so therefore supply and demand would mean that you have higher wages, except that we know in countries that we've lived in, or that we've studied in, or that we have knowledge of, that doesn't happen. Companies do not put up wages. If they can do anything that doesn't require putting up wages, they will turn themselves inside out not to pay more. And so I think, and especially that might happen to executive jobs. It does not happen to the lower level workers. That increase is not seen for your workers in your shops, in your street cleaners, in your nurses, in your teachers. You don't see the same increases. And the Netherlands has a shortage of primary school teachers. The UK is having a shortage of secondary school teachers. You're not seeing the increases in wages to attract more people from the unemployed into these roles. And in fact, when nursing, for example, in the UK was going through a real low, they had introduced or reintroduced the pay them to study method. We'll pay for your study. Thank you, bursary system. And they refuted it because they didn't want to pay the nurses. So they turned it round and cancelled it after a number of years, because they don't want to pay people. So the reality is that even if a country, I kind of find it difficult to believe that countries like the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, and countries like that, where I've just given you examples of how their employment is not having those effects, are actually using a system to keep unemployed people, keep a number of unemployed, not to keep the same unemployed people, of course, but to keep the number of unemployment. I find it really difficult, because the practice is just not the same. You see it all the time. The wages are not rising at the same rate. People are not experiencing that. And of course, there is this secondary issue, which is the link between the anti-other or even anti-people on benefits mentality, and that could be your own people on benefits mentality, that exists within countries like the Netherlands, like France, like the UK, like the European countries. That real sense of, if you're claiming benefits, you are the devils behind, that you're just really evil people that must claim benefits. So that mentality, at the same time as the policy that says, we need you to kind of be on benefits, to be honest.
See, that makes perfect sense to me that they would do that.
Because they're just wicked. Just wicked.
Well, yes, in part. But the other thing is
it's
that
a mind control trick.
It actually is, because if I design a system in which I need a certain amount of people to be unemployed, but then manage to whip up the populace into a frenzy where they are pointing the finger at the people that I have intentionally designed to be unemployed, you never examine the system.
Well, There is that. There is keeping us busy. Yes, there is keeping us busy. I mean, as I say, I think that it would be a full sense of economics. If your fiscal policy requires a certain level of unemployment in order that you can keep inflation down, and normally what people would understand by inflationary measures are interest rates are that's really the big teller for interest rates. People will always know is the big method of control fiscal policy wise. In addition to that, of course, tax rates on goods like food, the kind of fundamental goods that we all use, the essential goods, tax rates, and non-essential items as the other ways that they look at controlling the economy. But if you add employment to that mix, if you're adding unemployment to that mix, I think that you are literally saying our society is putting on a front that we are a capitalist society, while behind the scenes we are literally a government handout to rich people. That's literally because that's the only people that are benefiting.
But that's
from
exactly what governments are,
which is what is happening. But and I think that's why today's episode, I think, was more difficult to bring forward, just because I think when we talk about economic systems, when we talk about a whole country's fiscal policy, I think people think, well, I find that just unbelievable and out of my reach of trying to understand and trying to balance these trillions of dollar books. And what are we balancing here?
For me, as I said, just one of the simple things to grasp is the Phillips curve.
Right.
Right. And as I said, it tracks the inverse relationship between unemployment and wage inflation. And this is one of the things that you can look at maximum sustainable employment through that lens. And you will see, when you look at that pattern and how it operates, you need there to be a certain level of unemployment to control inflation. And
Right.
this is an actual model that is used
Right.
by governments and fiscal bodies to trade off between inflation and unemployment.
Yeah.
Right. And so in doing so, then you have to accept we're saying there's going to be, or we require, and if we a certain level of unemployment, because if we want inflation to be at this rate, then we need the employment to be at this rate.
Right.
And the fact that the model you build into your fiscal policy says, we know there's going to be unemployment, we require the unemployment, but you know what? We're going to demonize the unemployed.
We're and effectively we're trading off the social budget. How much does the social budget cost us versus how much is inflation going to cost us? That's really what you're saying effectively. So the price that you would have to pay people versus the price that I have to pay to keep you at home, pay you next to nothing in order to keep you at home, and then demonize you while you are at home, of course, and reduce your idea to nothing. I also think that there's kind of a footnote point here, which I think that people really need to think about. And I think this is, what is employment and unemployment? I think that we have too quickly given into the capitalist idea of what employment and unemployment is. And I think that that is just not helpful. It just doesn't, it's not helpful to the identity of being human. I wasn't made to be an employed or unemployed human. I was made to be human, and I was made to have a purpose, and I was made to I work and be productive and do those things. But does that mean I need to be employed or unemployed? And that is a whole can of worms that I think that people should begin to look into and examine for themselves. The idea that an unemployed person or an employed person, what is that? And why has that become the benchmark? Because I think that when we do start to look at that, we then start to redress some of these issues. People talk about the fact that, like, there is the hidden workforce, stay-at-home mums, for example, or stay-at-home parents, because they are both male and female, stay-at-home parents who are the hidden workforce, who, if you actually had to pay someone to do all their jobs, i.e. cooking, cleaning, looking after the children, doing all the school runs, doing all of these jobs that parents at that hidden workforce does at home. And sometimes, I know of cases where the person at home does the accounting even for the business. So you're talking about the free labor that is done by people at home, but you would look down on them because they are unemployed technically. Those are questions that we have to ask ourselves as a society when we're looking at issues of fiscal policy and capitalism and saying, well, this is a big system. How do we change it? Well, it starts with us changing really simple things, like asking ourselves this really simple question: why is unemployment being demonized? And what does unemployment even mean? I don't work for a massive company, small company.
Well, as I said to you, if you can demonize the unemployed, you're less likely to look at the system. You're less
Which is
likely
why
to
I
get
asked the
people to look at
question.
the system. So, look, I mean, here's the thing, Finland experimented with universal basic income. And the results of it were that it didn't prompt like a whole bunch of people to go back out to work. It didn't really change the unemployment statistics,
Yeah.
but it had other benefits, like health benefits. People were less stressed. They were happier. In fact, more people became entrepreneurial and decided to start their own business, and things like this. And I think, we need to start looking at these sort of concepts and policies, because if we're going to say that a maximum sustainable employment rate exists, and it's a sad society that says it's acceptable to say that we're going to know that some people are going to be unemployed, they're going to be in poverty, we're going to demonize them, we're going to know they're going to have problems, rather than saying it's better to give everybody a universal basic income. Because here's the thing, it didn't affect Finland's employment rate one way or another. So the employed stayed employed.
Yep.
Everybody was able to have their basic needs met sufficiently. It improved the health of the country. Of course, now if your country's healthier, you're spending less money on your health and welfare system.
Indeed.
Right? So it has all these other positive benefits, but for me, it's makes me question society in which we would demonize the idea of a universal basic income because some people won't work, those
Mhm.
scroungers, etc., etc.
Mhm.
But we would happily support a system in which we create those scroungers.
Yeah, and I think if I look at another example, I can't remember which state this is in, but there was an interview done with a business person in the United States, in a state where they were trialing upping the minimum wage to 70,000, I think it was. And so in that particular state, some businesses signed on to say, okay, we'll see you fail, basically. we'll trial it and then we'll see you fail. That's effectively what they were saying. If we pay our workers across the board 70K, we will lose profit, we will have to sack people, and then you will see this as a bad idea. And this one business owner said it worked so well that his business became so profitable that he actually expanded his business and was employing more people than he thought was possible before. So let me get this straight. When we pay people and they don't have to worry about their health care, and they don't have to stress about their bills, and they become more profitable. They become more, happy in their work, and they do better at their jobs, and they love what they do more. Imagine that. imagine a system in which you don't actually have to worry about any of your bills, any of that stuff, but you could actually just do your job that you love and get on with it. And I think that it goes to show, because sometimes a lot of people say, oh, you Europeans, smaller countries, less people, blah, 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 blah. Yes, I understand that. But there are also trials that are done in the USA, their big country, with companies who have the same principles that are being trialed in smaller countries. And it proves that it works across the board. It is not just in, small little countries in Europe. It can work elsewhere. I think it's sad that we've become so reliant upon a system that was built on the back of slaves that we can't see the humanity of people. That's, for me, capitalism. So there you go. That's my line about it.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I now hesitate to call the system capitalism, because, as I said, I don't think we've seen true capitalism at work and at play. I'd rather call the system exploitationism.
Well, I think capitalism was just the extension of exploitation, so I will agree with that. It was the system brought in after slavery to dupe us all into believing that we could all be profitable, which is clearly not the case. Keep the rich rich, and it's always profit before people, sadly. Always has been, and it seems like if we, the people, don't change, it always will be. All right, so that's us for this evening. Got a little bit over time, but I hope that people enjoyed it. Please continue to like, follow, and subscribe to get regular updates for the Darkside. You can follow us if you are following us on Facebook. Please do follow us on YouTube, because then you can share it a lot easier with your friends and family. I have a new outro that I'm quite excited to test, so I'll be doing that now, and then we will be signed off. Have a lovely evening. Peace out from me. I think peace from the other dude as well, or something. Have a good one. And we will see you next week for more discussions on the dark side. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, please do add it to the comments. All right, let's go.